Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Vibha and today we'll be discussing about management challenges in the 21st century. Challenges are what make life interesting and overcoming them is what makes life meaningful. Such a beautiful quote and very apt in our discussion today. We'll be covering the following points in the presentation today, and we're going to have a lot of discussion about competitive strategy, leadership, creativity, teamwork, technology in a presentation on management challenges. So you might be wondering where are the hot issues of today? They'll not be there. It deals exclusively with tomorrow's hot issues, the crucial, central, life and death issues that are certain to be the major challenges of tomorrow. Certain? Yes. For this is not a presentation on predictions, not a presentation about the future. The challenges and issues discussed in it are already with us in every one of the developed countries and in most of the emerging ones. They can already be identified, discussed, analyzed, and prescribed for. Those who do work on these challenges today and thus prepare themselves and the institutions for the new challenges will be the leaders and dominate tomorrow. Those who wait until these challenges have indeed become hot issues are likely to fall behind, perhaps never to recover. The PESTEL framework highlights six critical factors for management to consider when approaching the general business environment. The first one, politics, which plays a crucial role in business as there is a balance between free markets and systems of control. Economic factors are metrics which measure and assess the health of a given economic region or environment. Social factors or demographic factors assess the mentality of the individuals or consumers within a given market. Recognizing the potential technologies available to optimize internal efficiency or to avoid letting a product or service become technologically obsolete is a large challenge for management. Consumers and governments both penalize companies who have a large adverse effect on the environment or reward those who have a positive impact. Understanding the varying laws and regulations in a given region of operation is critical to avoiding unnecessary legal costs. Before moving on to the major challenges in the 21st century, we'll be discussing about the importance of assumptions, the art of getting things done through people. One of the definitions of management given by none other than Mary Parker Follett. Because her assumptions did not fit the realities which the budding discipline of management assumed in the 1930s and 1940s, she became a non person even before her death in 1933, with her work practically forgotten for 25 years or more. And yet, we now know that her basic assumptions regarding society, people, and management were far closer to reality than those on which the management people then based themselves. So, some of the earlier prevailing assumptions regarding management was that management is business management. There is or there must be one right organization structure. There is or there must be one right way to manage people. Now we move on to some of the recent trends in global scenario. World trade has been growing faster than the world's output. There has been rapid expansion of international financial markets. The presence of MNCs, that is transnational companies, free trade, mobilization of resources, freer exchange of resources between nations. Foreign investment and capital flows has increased across countries after the emergence of free trade, globalization, etc. Moving on to the first challenge, globalization. It is a trending topic in the business world today, garnering enormous attention as imports and exports continue to rise with companies expanding across the global marketplace. Before proceeding further, what exactly is globalization? It is the international integration of intercultural ideas, perspectives, products or services, culture and technology. Now let us discuss about the growth of globalization. It has resulted in large scale interdependence between countries as specialization, which is arguably the root cause of globalization, allows for specific regions to leverage their natural resources and abilities to efficiently produce specific products or services with which to trade for another country's specialization. This allows for a higher standard of living across the globe through higher efficiency, lower costs, and better quality, and a more innovative and dynamic workforce. The ease of modern globalization is often attributed to rapid technological developments in transportation and communication, which reduces the investment in time and costs. From a managerial perspective, the global workplace implies an enormous amount of diversity management. Estimates of the world labor pool in 2005 noted that multinational companies employed a stunning 3 billion workers cumulatively, which is nearly half of the entire world population. As a manager, this means developing a globally aware perspective that lends itself well to the specific geographic needs, values, and customs in which the business operates. Now, what are the challenges posed by globalization? Managers should also be aware of the best way to approach global demographics from a business to consumer perspective, taking an international product or service and localizing it successfully. There is a significant challenge necessitating consideration for different tastes and branding strategies during the implementation process. Now, let us talk about the varied challenges of globalization. Criticisms. A global economy is in many ways enforcing a global culture. This global culture is often criticized for taking the place of previously established domestic cultures and motivating consumerism. As a result, managers should carefully consider how to best localize products to retain cultural identity in the regions they operate. Environmental concerns are of great importance as well, as the constant energy utilization required for this interchange pollutes the environment and uses high quantities of valuable energy creating resources. Minimizing the damage done to the environment and offsetting it as best as possible through philanthropic giving is not only a wise marketing move but also a critical ethical consideration. So you see, in international products also many countries have this concept that if you are an MNC, then about 30% or 40% or even 60% of the products should be locally purchased. And like I mentioned about the global culture, which is leading to consumerism. So these are the major challenges posed by globalization. Now we'll be talking about the globalization process. The chart that you can see illustrates the complementary localizing and internationalizing responsibilities of a globalizing organization. The organization must place an international focus on product design, development, and QA to ensure its broad relevance, while also localizing marketing to tailor its appeal to individual markets. Managers must and also be particularly aware of the current criticisms of a highly global society, particularly as it pertains to ethical and environmental considerations. Now, I'll be discussing about a case study. The company that I've taken is one without which our days during the lockdown and the pandemic would have been really boring. Yes, I'm talking about Netflix. Netflix's global strategy is a big factor in the company's success. By 2017, it was operating in over 190 countries, and today, close to 73 million of its some 130 million subscribers are outside the US. Other US internet companies have scaled internationally, for example, Facebook and Google, but Netflix's globalization strategy and many of the challenges that it had to overcome are unique. Now, what were the challenges that Netflix faced? It had to secure content deals region by region and sometimes country by country. It also must face a diverse set of national regulatory restrictions, such as those that limit what content can be made available in the local markets. International subscribers, many of whom are not fluent in English, and many potential subscribers accustomed to free content remain hesitant to pay for streaming services at all. So you see, since it had to expand globally, there were many subscribers who were not fluent in English, and they wish that there must have been some programs or content on Netflix that were localized or of their native language. So Netflix made that possible. Furthermore, strong competition in streaming already exists in many countries. For example, in France and India, homegrown leaders offer local language video content, thus depriving Netflix of first mover advantage. In some countries like Germany and India, rivals such as Amazon Prime were already established. Yet the majority of Prime subscribers are in the US, and Netflix has managed to make inroads into even those markets where Prime arrived first. Now, Netflix, with its global reach, has more subscribers worldwide than all other pure streaming services combined. Now, we'll discuss about how did Netflix overcome these challenges. So Netflix did not try to enter all markets at once. Rather, it carefully selected its initial adjacent markets in terms of geography and psychic distance or perceived differences between markets. The choice of those markets was influenced by their degree of attractiveness, such as from shared similarities, the presence of affluent consumers, and the availability of broadband internet. Netflix has worked with and responded to the new markets it has entered. The company has partnered with key local companies to forge win-win relationships. In some cases, it has joined with cell phone and cable operators to make its content available as part of their existing video on demand offerings. Now, I'll give you an example. When Vodafone launched a TV service for its customers in Ireland, it included a dedicated Netflix button on its remote controls. So, Netflix has demonstrated that developing country specific knowledge is critical for success in local markets. This knowledge needs to be both broad and deep. Understanding local cultures ensured that Netflix could be sensitive to and respond to their differences. This enhanced its credibility and helped it forge smooth relationships with key stakeholders. Now you can see Vodafone's remote control having a dedicated Netflix button. Now, after combining these points, the globalized society presents enormous opportunities for businesses. Intercultural marketplaces allow for differing demographics, larger market potential, a more diverse customer base, and therefore more diverse product offering, and a highly valuable human resource potential. On the other end of the bargain, managers are tasked with localizing products and services effectively in a way that minimizes the adverse cultural and environmental effects caused by this rapid global expansion to maintain an ethical operation. Now we'll move on to the various other challenges and their impact on the work. Mass customization. It reduces the time taken, lowers cost, increases efficiency, and helps in quick adaptation to changes. This includes having a modular design and risk tolerance. Cost effectiveness includes selecting the methodology, setting target for change, developing a plan, and then implementing the plan. So corporation must implement a proper plan and see that they have been executed properly by the various managers at the different levels in the organization. Ecological concern. So the technologies to minimize damage, use of labelings such as ISO 14001, care of trees and animals. So corporation must ensure that they are sustainable in an era of ecology and globalization, and a lot of pollution is there as well. So a company which is ecologically, environmentally aware always has a better prospect. Ethical decision making. It is a key issue. It deals with beliefs and principles, duties and obligations on an organization. The duty of manager for ethical behavior. So if the manager is ethical, it automatically passes on to the employees. Now we'll take a case study of chocolate crisis in India, and we're taking the example of Cadbury, which as we all know is an MNC, and the crisis is when its power was threatened. The existence of a food company as big as Cadbury was threatened. And the fight was fought not in the legal courts but in the people's court. And at stake was the trust of 3 crore consumers who bought the company's products every month, giving it a 70% market share. So, to revive this eroded trust in the Cadbury brand, it bounced back with Project Vishwas. Now, starting with consumer education, it was one of the key elements of Cadbury's crisis management strategy. So, under this, It engaged over 2 lakh retailers that sold its products. Then it included a new packaging. So, having come face to face with a major crisis, Cadbury did not want to take any chances with consumer safety. So, it decided to revamp the entire packaging of its chocolate products. So, through extensive discussions, it was decided that metallic polyflow packaging would be more suitable to protect the product by completely sealing it. Then there was constant communication. So it did not happen that they implemented it and then they forgot about it. That did not happen. So they had a constant communication. So there was the highlight of Cadbury's crisis management strategy and the masses using the same platform that accentuated the crisis, that is, media. So in the first quarter of 2004, Cadbury increased its advertisement spending by over 15%, and it brought in Bollywood superstars as their brand ambassadors. So the immense popularity it enjoyed with the Indian masses helped the brand. So the consumers then again gave back Cadbury another chance, and market studies indicated that consumers eventually considered the incident as a lapse and not an intentional betrayal of trust to harm consumers. So, key learning from this is that responsibility of product quality and safety does not end with the product leaving its factory. It continues till the product is consumed by the end consumer. Now, with that, let us have a look at the major disruptors in every industry, the business environment changes that can prove to be both challenges and the biggest head turners for any organization. Starting off, I would like you all to take a moment to think, what does this image communicate to you? Just like this plane, a company that disrupts the market sets itself apart from its competitors, going off the tangent that was usually being followed in the industry. Disruption in a business sense is a process which introduces so powerful and fascinating changes in an industry that it invalidates the previous products or, in simpler terms, makes them obsolete. In the past few decades, with the immediate boost in technological advancement, these three business environment changes are present in almost every company that tastes success or experiences a crash. So, the three spheres that are listed are technology, innovation, and information management. Technology influences the functioning and management of every resource present in an organization. These are some significant factors that constantly challenge the status quo in this space. The first one being technological forecasting. Be it first mover advantage or comparative analysis, nothing is possible without the power of managers being able to track the future through present information enabled by technology. Automation. Can anyone give a quick example of automation? You can mention it in the comment section below. But today there's a constant buzz that robots will take over the employment of people, something that creates a challenge for future leaders to gauge through a situation where there is a need to coordinate not just human resources, but an artificial human with a real one. Operations like manufacturing, service sector companies like Uber, Ola will have to readjust a situation like this by constantly changing their way of working. Communication systems. Establishing an efficient communication system is important for an organization's well-being. After COVID-19, a number of companies switched to work from home forever because of internet availability around the clock. But how long can managers sustain a company in a shut environment is the new challenge. Information technology. Needless to say, information technology has invaded society like never before. It has three parts. The first consists of techniques for electronic data processing, second involves application of quantitative methods, and the third being simulation of higher order thinking. A decade earlier, nobody could have thought that we could direct Alexa to operate the light controls of our house. While it lets us take the benefits, it also raises the challenge of adjusting to a home controlled by a robot. Meanwhile, for the corporations, the challenge is to improve such technologies that are already hard to imagine. Innovation, as we all know, means the development and practical application of new ideas. The three steps in innovation are, if we talk about the three steps, we find that it starts with an idea or a concept. This, when worked upon, gives us a product, technology, and function. Further, proper production technologies also need to be developed to make it viable in the market. The time that it takes to turn a concept into a viable product is called the innovation lag. The challenge then arises to reduce the lag as much as possible to take the benefit of a good market share. Exactly what Tesla is trying to do today. The constant cycle, market researchers, focus groups, and the like are highly valued, and rightfully so. But still, they always focus on the company's products. They rarely focus on what the customer buys and is interested in. Only by being a customer themselves can they get true information about the outside world. So, to attract a greater market, a manager should step into the shoes of different customers and keep asking questions regarding the innovation at every stage of the constant cycle. So, does anyone know about the recent Cadbury ad which made headlines this Diwali? If you know about it, then do give this video a thumbs up and mention it in the comment section below. So you see, Cadbury broke its image of a particularly consumable centered brand and transcended into a company that cares for its beneficiaries. How did it do it? Artificial intelligence. Imagine the executive directors and managers who researched their possibility, built it into a service, and offered it on a pan India scale. The challenge it poses to its competitors is that of blurring the boundaries of what it really offers to the customers versus what it gives to its customers, all made possible through the power of innovative solutions. Seeing innovation as a core competence. Core competencies like competitive advantage are often considered unique to each organization. For example, for Zomato, its core competencies may include customer satisfaction, amazing marketing, and a grand chain of outlets. However, if you notice, each one of these is developed by innovation and it feeds to the need of getting better every next time so it does not stagnate at its current stature. So, innovation becomes an implicit competence that is required to gain other advantages. Similarly, the most successful of companies that are listed on your screen rely on this competence. Information management. Information is often confused with data collection, though it is not so. An adequate information system must lead the business managers to ask the right questions, not just feed them the information they expect. That presupposes first that executives know what information they need, obtain it on a regular basis, and integrate it into their decision making. Going outside the firm typically means fleshing out information that is relevant to an organization outside the four walls of the office. Doing this is fast becoming the major information challenge for all enterprises. But Fergal Quinn, the founder of a supermarket chain in Ireland called Super Quinn, understood the assignment. His secret was not better merchandise or lower prices. His secret was that all his company's executives, including himself, had to spend 2 days a week outside their offices. One day was spent actually doing a job in a supermarket, for example, by serving at a counter or as a manager for perishable foods. And one day was spent in competitor stores watching, listening, talking to the competitor's employees and the competitor's customers. The correct way of gathering information hence makes a business susceptible to sudden surprises of highs and lows. The lesser the sudden surprises, the better the stability. Finally, understanding a situation must be three-dimensional instead of two-dimensional. One must judge with an experience of past, current knowledge, and an information unbiased source enabled by technology. So, with that, next let's have a look at a case study. General Electric, a company owned by the famous Thomas Alva Edison, has been growing since more than 125 years thanks to its quick adaptability to changes. From light bulb to supersonic aircraft engineers, it has done it all. To give an example from the long journey, since Jack Welch took over as CEO in 1981, the General Electric company has created more wealth than any other company in the world. It spends 6 to 7% of its revenue essentially for research, speeding up its creation of a new engine per 10 years to one new engine every year. One of the main factors in this success that I wish to discuss was that GE organized the same information about the performance of every one of its business units differently for different purposes. It kept traditional financial and marketing reporting, but the same data were also organized for long term strategy. That is to show unexpected successes and unexpected failures, and also to show where actual events differed substantially from what was expected. A third way to organize the same data was to focus on the innovative performance, which became a major factor in determining compensation and bonuses of the manager. Finally, the data were organized to show how the business unit and its management treated and developed people, which then became a key factor in deciding on the promotion of an executive or general manager of a business unit. As we just saw, the technological innovations are very quick and necessary, and where these interact with sociological changes, they influence organizational relationships of the employees. With that, we move on to sociological challenges. Social pressures require managers to anticipate and stabilize total employment. In order to meet the demand of the employees and to utilize the latent human capability, future managers will have to develop more adaptive and humanistic structures in place of traditional bureaucratic management structures. So, some changes would be as follows. The first one being population trends. Population explosion would require new markets, jobs, methods of production and distribution, and several changes in business methods and operations. Besides this, an increasing proportion of older people due to increased average lifespan is causing a shift in the composition of the workforce. Second one, rise in education level. Increase in literacy will require better leadership, supervisory training, and executive development, and increase the number and role of intellectuals. As consumers become more knowledgeable and conscious, businesses will have to become more consumer oriented. Third, more leisure time. Increasing automation, affluence, and productivity may lead to reduced working hours and shorter work week. This may lead to multiple jobs for some, while it may require development of the tourism and entertainment industry for others. Fourth, trend away from individualism. People are growing less independent and more interdependent. The role of the individual is decreasing and that of the group is increasing. The trend is leading to professionalism, bureaucracy, interdependence between organizations, etc. Growing interdependence leads to multiple relationships and complexities of management. Moving on to diversity, which is the need of the hour. Diversity in the workplace is all about creating an inclusive environment, accepting of every individual's differences, enabling all employees to achieve their full potential, and as a result, allowing your business to reach its fullest potential. If you value each person's differences, then you're allowing each person to contribute their unique experiences and perspectives, which can have an extremely positive impact on work, other employees, motivation, productivity, and consumer experience. Now, why is diversity and its management required? As I mentioned earlier, globalization has resulted in enormous cross cultural relationships along with high percentages of domestic diversity. As globalization creates higher potential value in approaching diverse markets and demographics, understanding how to manage a diverse community internally is a priority for management. This opportunity, if not properly utilized, becomes a threat as the competition grows more effective at leveraging diversity to create synergy. Stemming from various legislative initiatives in the 1960s in the US, the concept of equality and a fair distribution of opportunity became an international focus. As the decades passed, this focus shifted from a legal requirement to a social expectation. Finally, the idea of equality became a societal norm. This evolving outlook on a diverse workplace has ultimately resulted in the recognition and implementation of diversity management and intercultural understandings within organizations, creating stronger and more ethical business practices. Now, moving on to the challenges. Challenges to diversity naturally occur as a result of the following. The first one being communication. It is at the heart of diversity, but not necessarily for obvious reasons. Linguistic differences, while certainly a challenge, can be addressed by learning new languages or translating materials. The more difficult challenge is the intangibles in communication that arise from cultural expectations. Overlooking these cultural differences can result in miscommunication that may go unrecognized. Now, let me give you an example. Etiquette for receiving a business card in China requires accepting it with both hands and taking a full moment to read it. Following this, recipients place the card face up on the table in front of them during the meeting, referring to it whenever necessary. Overlooking these customs sends unintentional messages that can do irreversible damage. Moving on to majority hegemony. Majorities in businesses creating a homogeneous culture is also a substantial threat. This hegemony can create tension between different groups, ultimately resulting in the smaller groups moving towards the culture of the larger ones to close the dissonance, which is a practice called assimilation. Assimilation should be a shared responsibility, not simply assumed by those in the minority group. Groupthink. Groupthink is when many people within the same organization begin to adopt similar perspectives, usually to simplify meetings and minimize discord. On the surface, this consonance sounds like a good thing. As the global economy requires businesses to understand varying perspectives, it also necessitates the cultivation of these diverse perspectives internally. Groupthink will often result in the assimilation of dissenting perspectives. The opportunity cost is that without differences in perspective, companies have little room to expand or innovate new solutions. Personal biases. So, the research of psychologist Daniel Kahneman has shown that the majority of human decisions are based on biases, beliefs, and intuition, not facts or logic. That's why, even with the best intentions, people have the tendency to bring bias into their everyday interactions, including in the workplace. Internal resistance. Unfortunately, not everyone is on board with the idea of diversity in the workplace. Some people are just uncomfortable with the unfamiliar and will eventually adjust, but others may actively opposed to the idea of intentionally building diversity in the workplace. Now, what should be the role of the management to manage diversity in a workplace? Firstly, for the organization to value diversity and inclusion, the top level management must incorporate diversity to send clear signals to all levels and lead by example. Next, inclusive treatment and fair opportunities for growth should be provided to all employees. Then we must have free and open communication and expression of ideas, opinions, and problems should be ensured with support groups to discuss similar issues and work on their solutions. The recruitment and selection process must be fair with a heterogeneous group of recruiters. Another important thing is that the organization must provide diversity and sensitivity training to enable employees to understand and appreciate individual and cultural differences. Gender sensitization training must also be included in this curriculum. Last but not the least, strict policies against discrimination and harassment should be in place, and their violation must be strictly dealt with. Managers must not only be aware of diversity in the workplace but also open minded and empathetic to perspectives other than their own. Effective managers in diverse situations have a highly developed degree of cultural competence that empowers them to use careful observation skills to determine what gestures, phrases, customs, and values would be most appropriate in a given circumstance. Adroit management must also work actively against groupthink, empowering everyone not only to speak but to be brave enough to go against the majority opinion. The goal for management is to ensure everyone is working to assimilate to everyone else in a balanced and effective manner that harvests differences rather than smoothing them over. Now, I'll be undertaking an example, but before we move forward, I have a question for you, and I want you to comment that in the comment section below. It is an American multinational pharmaceutical consumer packaged goods and medical devices manufacturer founded in 1886. It is headquartered in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and listed in the Fortune 500. I'm pretty sure that most of our families have used its products for us when we were kids. So if you have guessed the answer, then do write it in the comment section below. And the correct answer is Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson has various ways of diversifying their company. Various rewards and recognitions the company has received include being recognized by US Veterans Magazine as the best of the best for strides made in diversity efforts and being one of only two companies that have been on the Working Mother 100 Best list for the past 28 years. Primarily, the company utilizes four main programs to help it be more diverse and build inclusion on an ongoing basis, not just from time to time. First is the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, which is led by the Chief Diversity Officer, who reports directly to the CEO of the company, meaning that the whole operation is being overseen by the top level management. The mentoring groups at Johnson & Johnson look to expand learning opportunities and support development of a diverse workforce by making these nurturing relationships available to an ever increasing number of employees across the enterprise. These opportunities are both informal and formal. Employee resource groups (ERGs) are organized by employees that volunteer their services to engage in discussions and other activities with fellow employees. Employees share their experiences and interests with each other, which leads to a better understanding of the interests and personal perspectives among employees. This results in higher levels of communication and understanding cross culturally. Diversity University was created to boost the effectiveness of the previous programs and transfer those beliefs to Johnson & Johnson's global employees. It is a self-guided dynamic e-learning curriculum built on exercises which strengthen skills and educate each participant to gain an understanding of all cultures. So, that was from sociological challenges and diversity in the workplace. From that, we move on to knowledge worker productivity. So let us begin. The term knowledge worker was first coined by Peter Drucker in his book, The Landmarks of Tomorrow. Drucker defined knowledge workers as high-level workers who apply theoretical and analytical knowledge acquired through formal training to develop products and services. As per Drucker, the most valuable assets of the 21st century will be its knowledge workers and the productivity. Now, what will be the characteristics of knowledge workers? First, they possess factual and theoretical knowledge. Knowledge workers undergo several years of formal training to master the information needed to perform certain specialized roles. For example, a pharmacist requires factual and theoretical knowledge of various medications before they can dispense medications and advise patients. Second, accessing and applying information. Knowledge workers must know how to identify important data from a large database of information. They should be in a position to weed out less important information and focus on essential information that will help them solve problems, answer questions, and generate ideas. Third, good communication skills. Knowledge work involves frequent communication between the knowledge worker and customers, co-workers, subordinates, and other stakeholders. They must be able to speak, read, write, and hold discussions with workmates and deliver a presentation when needed. Fourth, motivation. Workers must be interested and motivated in finding new information and applying it in their work. Finally, intellectual capabilities. Knowledge workers must have the requisite intellectual capabilities to acquire the skills necessary for efficiently completing their work. Now, what would be the difference between knowledge work and traditional work? Skills or knowledge sets. So the skill set of knowledge work is usually specialized and deep, while the skill set of traditional work is narrow and often functional. Locus of work. The locus of work is in groups and projects for knowledge work, while it revolves around individuals in case of traditional work. Focus of work. The main focus of knowledge work is customers, problems, and issues. On the other hand, the focus area of traditional work is tasks, objectives, and performance. Fourth, performance measures. For knowledge work, the effectiveness of the process serves as a measure of performance, while for traditional work, completion of task deliverables determine performance. Fifth, activity or feedback cycles. In case of knowledge work, the activity and feedback cycles are lengthy from a business perspective, while they are primary and of an immediate nature in case of traditional work. Employees' loyalty. The employees' loyalty is for professions, networks, and peers in case of knowledge work, and towards the organization and his or her career systems in case of traditional work. Impact on company success. For knowledge work, there are a few major contributions of strategic and long-term importance, while in traditional work, there are many small contributions that support the master plan. Now let us compare manual work and knowledge work with the help of a case study. Come example. Say we buy a new tool. Now in case of manual work, the workers shall use that new tool, as a result of which productivity shall increase, thereby leading to a decline in costs. However, in case of knowledge work, we notice that once new tools are bought, the company shall pay to train workers on efficiently using those tools. This results in an increase in the value of workers, and they use the new tool to make output, which is even more valuable. Thereby, the costs increase. This shows that knowledge workers are indeed an asset, a capital asset, which needs to grow. Taylor's principles of manual work productivity. Moving on to a yet another important concept. The first step in making the manual worker productive is to look at the task and to analyze its constituent motions. The next step is to record each motion, the physical effort, and the time it takes. Then motions that are not needed can be eliminated. Then each of the remaining motions is set up so as to be done the simplest and the easiest way that puts the least physical and mental strain on the operator and requires the least time. Then these motions are put together again into a job that is in a logical sequence. Finally, the tools needed to do the motions are redesigned. Now we look at 5 major factors that determine knowledge worker productivity. The first being, what is the task? Knowledge worker productivity demands that we ask the question, what is the task? Autonomy. It demands that we impose a responsibility for the productivity on the individual knowledge workers themselves. They have to manage themselves and have a certain level of autonomy. Third, continuous learning and teaching. Knowledge work requires not only continuous learning on the part of the knowledge worker, but also equally continual teaching. Quality. Productivity of the knowledge worker is not primarily a matter of the quantity of output. Quality is at least as important. Asset. Finally, the knowledge worker is required to be seen and treated as an asset rather than a cost. Now, what is a task? Unlike manual work, the most crucial question in knowledge worker productivity is, what is a task? In manual work, the key question is always, how should the work be done, as the task is always given. But in knowledge work, the task does not program the worker and therefore arises a question, what is the task? The first requirement in tackling knowledge work is to find out what the task is so as to make it possible to concentrate knowledge workers on the task and to eliminate everything else. This requires that the knowledge worker ask themselves 4 questions. What is your task? What should it be? What should you be expected to contribute? And what hampers you in doing your task and should be eliminated? Moving on to the next topic, that is the knowledge worker as a capital asset. Knowledge worker productivity requires that the knowledge worker is both seen and treated as an asset rather than a cost. They own the means of production and must be considered a capital asset. In order to understand this better, let's take the help of a case study based on the Ford Motor Company. They increased the pay of skilled workers from 80 cents a day to $5 a day in January 1914. It did so because its turnover had been so excessive as to make its labor costs prohibitively high. It had to hire 60,000 people a year to keep 10,000. Even so, everybody, including Henry Ford himself, was convinced that the higher wages would greatly reduce the company's profits. Instead, in the very first year, profits almost doubled. Paid $5 a day, practically no workers left jobs. In fact, the Ford Motor Company soon had a waiting list. This thereby proves that the knowledge worker is a capital asset. A very large number of knowledge workers do both knowledge work and manual work. Peter Drucker calls them the technologists. Let's take the example of surgeons. While preparing for an operation to correct a brain aneurysm, they spend hours in diagnosis before they cut, and that requires specialized knowledge of the highest order. Then again, during the surgery, an unexpected complication may occur that calls for theoretical knowledge and judgment, both of the very highest order. But the surgery itself is manual work consisting of repetitive manual operations. The 3 elements for making technologists effective are as follows. Answer to the question, what is the task? The answer is loud and clear, a satisfied customer. The technologists have to take full responsibility for giving customer satisfaction, that is, for delivering quality. Technologists have to be treated as knowledge workers. Let's take one final and very interesting case study to understand why knowledge workers have been more productive from home. So in 2013, HBR, that is Harvard Business Review, conducted a research upon knowledge workers. They gathered data on 329 specific activities undertaken by 45 knowledge workers. They broke down activities into 6 categories, that is managing across, which means interacting with peers and colleagues, desk-based work, externally facing work, which means interacting with anyone outside the company, managing down, which means interacting with subordinates, managing up, which means interacting with the boss or someone else that is senior, and training and development. They went on to conduct the survey, and you can see the results of the survey on the screen. In 2013, knowledge workers spent 38% of the time managing across in meetings, often with many colleagues, and 33% of the time doing desk based work on their own. Externally focused work, example talking to customers, managing down, example coaching and supporting subordinates, and managing up, example interacting with the boss and other senior people, all got very little time, while training and personal development got almost none, as you can see. But then in March 2020, that is after the lockdown and the pandemic struck, suddenly many of the working man force were sent home and forced to develop new ways of working. So HBR decided to replicate the 2013 study using the same questions as before and interviewing respondents with similar profiles. How has this picture changed during lockdown? The key findings from the research were as follows. Lockdown helps us focus on the work that really matters. We are spending 12% less time drawn into large meetings and 8% more time interacting with customers and external partners. Desk-based work continues to take a third of our time. Some other changes were a little less time managing up and a little more time on training and development, which were not statistically very significant. So to sum up, lockdown has been positive for knowledge worker productivity in the short term. It has enabled them to prioritize their work and be more efficient. Now let us talk about strategy, the new certainties. Why strategy? Every organization operates on a theory of the business. That is a set of assumptions as to what its business is, what its objectives are, how it defines results, who its customers are, what the customers value and pay for. Strategy converts its theory of the business into performance. Its purpose is to enable an organization to achieve its desired results in an unpredictable environment. For strategy allows an organization to be purposefully opportunistic. There are indeed five phenomena, as you can see, that can be considered certainties. They are, however, different from anything present strategies consider. Above all, they are not essentially economic, they are primarily social and political. These five certainties are the collapsing birth rate in the developed world, shifts in the distribution of disposable income, defining performance, global competitiveness, the growing incongruence between economic globalization and political splintering. Now, let us talk about the collapsing birth rate. The most important single new certainty, if only because there is no precedent for it in all of history, is the collapsing birth rate in the developed world. In Western and Central Europe and in Japan, the birth rate has already fallen well below the rate needed to reproduce a population. That is below 2.1 live births for women of reproductive age. Birth rates can change and can do so quite fast, as American experience after World War II has proved. But even if the birth rates in the developed world were to turn up drastically, it would take 20 years or so before these new babies would reach the age at which they would join the labor force. There is nothing except unprecedentedly massive immigration that can prevent a sharp drop in the labor force of traditional age, that is below 60 or 65 in the developed world in the US after 2025 or so, in the rest of the developed world much earlier. Some of the implications are very clear. For the next 20 or 30 years, demographics will dominate the politics of all developed countries, and they will inevitably be politics of great turbulence. No country is prepared for these issues. Indeed, in no country are political factions and political parties aligned around the issues that demographics pose. For the next 20 or 30 years, no developed country is likely, therefore, to have stable politics or a strong government. Government instability is going to be the norm. Retirement may come to mean two different things. It is quite likely that the trend towards early retirement will continue, but it will no longer mean that a person stops working. It will come to mean that a person stops working full time or as an employee for an organization for the entire year rather than a few months at a time. Employment relations, traditionally among the most rigid and most uniform relationships, are likely to become increasingly heterogeneous and increasingly flexible, at least for older people. The financial implication is that in all developed countries, the productivity of all workers, whether full time or part time, and especially of all knowledge workers, will have to increase very rapidly. Otherwise, the country and every organization in it will lose position and become steadily poorer. Moving on to the distribution of income. Shifts in the shares of disposable income are just as important as shifts in population, but usually even less attention is paid to them, and they are likely indeed all but certain to be as dramatic as the demographic changes during the first decades of the 21st century. Businesses and industries have become highly conscious of the market standing. They all keep figures on their sales and know whether their sales will go up or down. All of them know whether they grow in volume or not, but practically none knows the truly important figure. That is, the share of the disposable income of their customers. Whether other institutions and businesses or ultimate consumers that is being spent on the products or services that they produce and sell. And practically no one knows whether the share goes up or down. Shares and disposable income are the foundation of all economic information. The four growth sectors during the 21st century were government, healthcare, education, and leisure. Now we'll be defining the factors, the first one being defining performance. Demographics have within the last 50 years shifted property in all developed countries. We now are beginning to see the resultant shifts in power. Two developments, that is the emergence of an affluent, though by no means rich, middle class of non-manual workers and the extension of life expectancy have led to the development of institutions such as the pension funds and the mutual funds. And these are now the legal owners of the key property in a modern developed society, that is of the publicly owned corporations. Global competitiveness. Moving on to a yet another important concept, all institutions have to make global competitiveness a strategic goal. No institution, whether a business, university, or a hospital, can hope to survive, let alone to succeed, unless it measures up to the standards set by the leaders in its field. Any place in the world. One implication, it is no longer possible to base a business or a country's economic development on cheap labor. However low its wages, a business, except for the smallest and most purely local one, for example, a local restaurant, is unlikely to survive, let alone to prosper, unless its workforce rapidly attains the productivity of the leaders of the industry any place in the world. This is truly particularly in manufacturing. The growing incongruence between economic reality and political reality. The final fundamental on which to base strategy in the period of worldwide structural change and uncertainty is the growing incongruence between economic reality and political reality. The world economy is increasingly becoming global. National boundaries are impediments and cost centers. Business and many other institutions as well can no longer define their scope in terms of national economies and national boundaries. They have to define the scope in terms of industries and services worldwide. But at the same time, political boundaries are not going to go away. In fact, it is doubtful that even the new regional economic units, such as the NAFTA or Mercosur, the proposed economic community in South America, will actually weaken political boundaries, let alone overcome them. We have, in fact, three overlapping spheres. There is a true global economy of money and information. There are regional economies in which goods circulate freely and in which impediments to the movement of services and of people are being cut back, though by no means eliminated. And then increasingly, there are national and local realities, which are both economic but above all political. Let's take a case study to understand the importance of global competitiveness for a business. The best example is Mexico, which for 50 years from 1929 on had a deliberate policy of building its domestic economy independent of the outside world. It did this not only by building high walls of protectionism to keep foreign competition out, it did it, and this was uniquely Mexican in the 20th century world, by practically forbidding its own companies to export. This attempt to create a modern but purely Mexican economy failed dismally. Mexico actually became increasingly dependent on imports, both of food and of manufactured products, from the outside world. It was finally forced to open itself to the outside world since it simply could no longer pay for the needed imports. And then Mexico found that a good deal of its industry could not survive. Similarly, the Japanese tried to protect the bulk of their business and industry by keeping the foreigners out, while creating a small but exceedingly competitive number of export industries and then providing these industries with capital at very low or no cost. thus giving them a tremendous competitive advantage. That policy too has failed. The present 1999 crisis in Japan is in large part the result of the failure to make the bulk of Japanese business and industry, and especially its financial industries, globally competitive. Strategy therefore has to accept a new fundamental. Any institution and not just businesses has to measure itself against the standards set by each industry's leaders any place in the world. So, to conclude, these were the top challenges faced by the management within organizations. Being prepared means knowing what challenges you face and taking the steps to anticipate or address them. Succeeding in today's business world is to embrace uncertainty with knowledge and a plan of action. Hopefully, this presentation can help you to start to think of the right strategies and tools to take on these challenges with confidence. With With that, we come to the end of the presentation on management challenges in the 21st century. It takes a lot of hard work to make these videos, researching on the topics and presenting it before you all. So it would be really nice if you could show your love and support because it helps me get motivated to create more content. So do love, like, share, subscribe to this video and comment your views, any suggestions, feedbacks in the comment section below. Thank you for watching. Bye.